The explosion happened at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September, shattering windows 3 houses down and launching Karen Whitfield's custom-built pergola clear across her neighbor's pristine lawn. But this story doesn't start with a blast that would make national headlines. It begins 18 months earlier with Karen standing in her immaculate kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, listening to words that would change everything. "Ma'am, I'm calling from the city planning department regarding your recent permit application." The clerk's voice crackled through the speaker. "Your request for the basement conversion has been denied." Karen's manicured fingers tightened around her phone as she stared out at her backyard oasis, the one she spent 3 years and $40,000 perfecting. The same backyard that would soon become ground zero for a disaster that could have been prevented with a simple word: compliance. Denied? Karen's voice rose an octave. "That's impossible. I've lived in Millbrook Estates for 12 years. I know every rule in this neighborhood." What Karen didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that knowing the rules and following them were two entirely different things. The Whitfield residence at 1247 Maple Grove Drive was the crown jewel of their upscale subdivision. Karen had transformed the modest 4-bedroom colonial into what she called her forever home, complete with granite countertops, heated floors, and a wine cellar that could house 200 bottles. Her neighbors often joked that Karen should charge admission for her annual garden parties, where she'd proudly showcase each renovation with the enthusiasm of a museum curator. But beneath the picture-perfect exterior lay a web of shortcuts, unpermitted work, and willful ignorance that would prove catastrophic. The trouble had started innocuously enough. 3 years prior, Karen decided her teenage son Tyler needed more space. The finished basement seemed perfect for conversion into a teen suite, gaming area, bedroom, and bathroom. It would give him independence while keeping him close. What concerned parent wouldn't want that? The problem was the permits. The city required extensive documentation for basement conversions, updated electrical systems, proper ventilation, egress windows, and most critically, compliance with fire safety codes. The process would take months and cost thousands in fees and inspections. Karen had a different plan. "I know a guy," her contractor, Mike DeLuca, had said with a knowing wink. "We can get this done in 6 weeks, cash deal. The city inspector won't even know it exists." Mike DeLuca was the kind of contractor who specialized in what he called neighborhood improvements, work that looked professional but cut every corner possible. No permits, no inspections, no paper trail. Just fast, cheap results for homeowners who value convenience over compliance. Karen should have walked away. She should have called the city, filed the proper paperwork, and waited for approval like every other responsible homeowner. Instead, she made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "When can you start?" she asked. As Mike's truck pulled into her driveway that first Monday morning, tools rattling in the bed, Karen felt a thrill of excitement. She was finally getting what she wanted, on her timeline within her budget. The basement conversion would be her little secret, one that would remain hidden until the morning everything went horribly, catastrophically wrong. In 18 months, this same basement would become a death trap. But that September morning, with Mike's crew carrying equipment through her front door, Karen Whitfield felt like the smartest woman in Millbrook Estates. She had no idea she was about to become the most notorious. Mike DeLuca arrived every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, his white pickup truck loaded with tools that Karen quickly learned to recognize by sound. The screaming whir of the circular saw meant he was cutting through support beams. The rhythmic pounding indicated drywall insulation. And the smell of burning plastic that occasionally wafted upstairs? That was just normal construction odors, according to Mike. Karen should have questioned that smell. The basement transformation progressed rapidly. Within 2 weeks, Mike had gutted the original finished basement, removing walls and reconfiguring the entire layout. What had once been a simple rec room with proper ventilation became an intricate maze of rooms: bedroom, bathroom, entertainment area, and storage space. Each addition required electrical work, plumbing modifications, and most critically, proper ventilation systems that Mike assured Karen were totally up to code. They weren't. "See, what most people don't understand," Mike explained as he installed a bathroom exhaust fan directly into the main HVAC return duct, "is that the city codes are written by bureaucrats who've never swung a hammer. This way is more efficient." Karen nodded, impressed by his expertise. The exhaust fan installation looked professional with neat ductwork and a quiet motor. What she couldn't see was that Mike had connected bathroom exhaust directly into the system that circulated air throughout her entire house. Every shower Tyler took would pump humidity and potentially dangerous gases into the main ventilation system. The electrical work was equally creative. Rather than running new circuits from the main panel as code required, Mike tapped into existing circuits, overloading systems that were never designed to handle the additional load. He buried junction boxes behind drywall, eliminated GSI protection in the bathroom, and installed outlets without proper grounding. Each shortcut saved time and money while creating invisible fire hazards throughout the basement. The beauty of this setup, Mike said, gesturing to his handiwork, is that it's completely invisible. No inspector will ever think to look for it. Karen felt clever. While her neighbors dealt with permit delays and inspection schedules, her project moved forward seamlessly. She even hosted her book club during the third week of construction, proudly leading friends past the basement entrance. Just having some minor updates done, she told Margaret Chen, her next-door neighbor who'd been struggling with her own renovation permits for months. Nothing major, just making better use of the space. Margaret glanced at the construction debris being hauled through Karen's garage. Looks pretty extensive. Did you need permits for all this? Oh, you know how these contractors exaggerate everything, Karen laughed, avoiding a direct answer. Mike assures me it's all routine maintenance. That evening, Karen's husband, David, returned from his business trip to find their basement completely transformed. The space that had been cluttered storage just 3 weeks earlier now resembled a luxury apartment. This is incredible, David said, running his hand along the smooth drywall. The permit process must have been a nightmare. Karen busied herself straightening towels in the new bathroom. Actually, Mike handled all the paperwork. Apparently, most of this qualified as maintenance rather than renovation. It was her first direct lie about the project, but it wouldn't be her last. David, exhausted from travel and trusting his wife's thoroughness, didn't question the explanation. Like most busy professionals, he assumed Karen had handled the bureaucratic details while he focused on his career. This division of labor had worked perfectly for their marriage, until it became a conspiracy of willful ignorance. The final week of construction brought the most dangerous shortcuts. Mike installed a gas line for a decorative fireplace, running flexible tubing through walls without proper supports or shut-off valves. He connected the water heater vent to improvised ductwork that terminated in the crawl space rather than extending to the exterior. Most critically, he installed a bedroom window that looked impressive but was too small to serve as an emergency egress, a violation that would prove fatal in a fire scenario. All done, Mike announced on a Friday afternoon, collecting his final payment in cash. Your boy's going to love this setup. Just remember our deal, what happens in the basement stays in the basement. Karen handed him the envelope containing $4,000, feeling satisfied with her investment. Tyler would have the perfect teen retreat, David would be impressed with her project management skills, and she'd save nearly half the cost of a permitted renovation. As Mike's truck disappeared down Maple Grove Drive, Karen stood in her new basement suite admiring the professional-looking results. The paint smell was already fading, the floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and everything appeared flawlessly executed. She couldn't see the gas leak developing behind the decorative fireplace, slowly filling the crawl space with combustible fumes. She couldn't detect the carbon monoxide that would begin accumulating once the improperly vented water heater started operating under load. And she had no way of knowing that the overloaded electrical circuits were already running dangerously hot inside the walls. Karen's dream basement was complete. Her nightmare was just beginning. Tyler moved into his new basement suite on a crisp October morning, hauling his gaming setup, clothes, and teenage treasures down the carpeted stairs. For Karen, watching her 17-year-old son settle into the space felt like a parenting victory. She'd given him independence while keeping him safe under her roof. The first warning sign appeared within a week. Mom, something's weird with the lights down here, Tyler called up the stairs. They keep flickering when I turn on my computer and Xbox at the same time. Karen descended to investigate, finding Tyler's gaming station illuminated by the strobing glow of overhead lights that dim and brighten rhythmically. She flipped the wall switch a few times and the lights stabilized. Probably just needs to warm up, she said, dismissing the obvious electrical overload. Old house quirks, you know. Tyler shrugged and returned to his game, but Karen made a mental note to mention it to David. She never did. Over the following weeks, as Tyler learned to manage his electronics to avoid the worst flickering, a warning became routine background noise, easily ignored until it wasn't. The second sign was more subtle, but far more dangerous. Margaret Chen knocked on Karen's door on a chilly November afternoon, holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a concerned expression. Karen, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you noticed any unusual smells lately? Karen's stomach tightened. Smells. It's probably nothing, Margaret continued, but sometimes when I'm in my backyard, I catch this strange odor coming from your side of the fence. Almost like gas, or maybe something chemical. The smell was coming from Karen's crawl space, where the improperly vented water heater was slowly filling the area with carbon monoxide and combustion byproducts. The flexible gas line Mike had installed was also developing micro-leaks, releasing natural gas into the confined space beneath the house. Oh, that, Karen laughed, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. David's been working on some home improvement projects. You know how these old houses are, always something that needs fixing. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Well, if you ever need a second opinion, my brother-in-law is a licensed plumber. Gas leaks can be really dangerous. I'll keep that in mind, Karen replied, already closing the door. Thanks for the cookies. That evening, Karen did something she would later regret. She opened all the basement windows and ran 3 fans to air out the space. The immediate smell problem disappeared, but she'd inadvertently created a new hazard by disrupting the already compromised ventilation system. The third warning arrived in December via an official-looking envelope from Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Dear Mrs. Whitfield, the letter began, we have received reports of possible unpermitted construction at your residence. As per HOA regulations, all exterior modifications and major interior renovations require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Karen's hands trembled as she read the complaint. Someone had reported the construction degrees, the contractor's daily visits, and the installation of the basement window that was visible from the street. The HOA was requesting documentation of all permits within 30 days. She had no permits to provide. That night, Karen paced her kitchen, reading and rereading the letter while David watched television upstairs, unaware of the crisis brewing. She could confess everything to David, hire a lawyer, and try to retroactively obtain permits. The process would be expensive, complicated, and potentially require tearing out Mike's work to bring everything up to code. Or she could lie. Karen chose deception. She crafted a response claiming the work was routine maintenance and repairs that didn't require permits under city code. She cited specific ordinances she'd researched online, carefully wording her response to sound authoritative while avoiding direct falsehoods. The letter bought her time while moving her deeper into a web of deliberate deception. The fourth warning came during the Christmas holidays when Tyler complained of persistent headaches. I feel fine upstairs, but every morning I wake up with this pounding headache, he told Karen while grabbing breakfast. And sometimes I feel kind of dizzy when gaming late at night. Carbon monoxide poisoning presents with exactly these symptoms, but Karen attributed Tyler's complaints to typical teenage behavior, too much screen time, irregular sleep, poor diet. She bought him a humidifier and suggested he take breaks from gaming. The headaches persisted and worsened. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Tyler's pediatrician, was more concerned during his January checkup. Has Tyler been exposed to any new chemicals or environmental factors? She asked Karen after examining the teenager. These symptoms, headaches, fatigue, occasional nausea, could indicate exposure to something toxic. Karen's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. Not that I'm aware of. Could it be stress? He's been working hard on college applications. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. Possibly, but I'd like to run some blood tests to rule out other causes. And Karen, there have been any home renovations or changes to his living space that could be relevant. Nothing major, Karen replied, the lie now coming easily. Just routine maintenance. The blood tests would reveal elevated carbon monoxide levels, but the results wouldn't arrive for another week. By then, other forces were already in motion. City Inspector James Rodriguez had been having a busy winter. Anonymous complaints about unpermitted work were flooding his office, and the address 1247 Maple Grove Drive had appeared on his list 3 separate times. Different complainants, but the same concerns. Extensive renovation work without visible permits. On a cold February morning, Rodriguez parked his city vehicle in Karen's driveway and walked to the front door, clipboard in hand and authority in his step. Karen watched from her kitchen window as he approached, her carefully constructed world about to face its first official challenge. She had 30 seconds to decide how to handle the moment that would determine whether her deception continued or exploded into public scandal. The doorbell rang. Karen smoothed her blouse and opened the door with what she hoped was a confident smile. Inspector James Rodriguez stood on her porch, his weathered face serious but not unkind. He held a tablet and wore the kind of expression that suggested he'd done this dance many times before. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Inspector Rodriguez from the City Planning Department. I need to discuss some concerns about work that may have been performed at this address. Of course, Karen replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart, though I'm not sure what concerns you might have. We haven't done any major work recently. Rodriguez consulted his tablet. Ma'am, I have 3 separate complaints about extensive renovation work, contractor vehicles, and construction degrees at this property over the past several months. I also have photos of a new basement window installation that appears to require permits. Karen's mind raced. Photos meant neighbors were documenting her activities. The window installation had been visible from the street, an oversight she now regretted. Inspector Rodriguez, I think there may be some confusion. We did have some routine maintenance done. A handyman helped with some minor repairs, but certainly nothing that would require permits. I see. Rodriguez made a note on his tablet. Would you mind if I take a look at this maintenance work? Sometimes what homeowners consider minor can actually fall under permit requirements. This was the moment. Karen could allow the inspection, which would immediately reveal the illegal construction, or she could refuse and buy time while escalating the situation. She chose a middle path that would prove disastrous. "I'd be happy to show you around," she said, "but my son is currently sick and resting downstairs. Could we possibly schedule this for later in the week?" It wasn't entirely a lie. Tyler had been complaining of worsening headaches and nausea, but Karen was really buying time to figure out her next move. Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly. "Mrs. Whitfield, if there's unpermitted work in your basement and your son is experiencing health issues, that's actually a priority concern. Indoor air quality problems often result from improper ventilation or electrical work." Karen felt the walls closing in. "He just has a winter cold. Nothing serious. I understand, but I'm required to note the health concern in my report. This actually escalates the inspection priority." Rodriguez handed her his card. "I'll need to return within 48 hours for a full inspection. Please have any documentation of your maintenance work available." As Rodriguez walked back to his vehicle, Karen's carefully constructed facade began crumbling. She had less than 2 days to either produce permits that didn't exist or find a way to hide evidence of Mike's extensive work. That evening, Karen made her second catastrophic decision. Instead of confessing to David and seeking legal help, she called Mike DeLuca. "Mike, I need your help. The city inspector came by asking about permits." There was a long pause. "Karen, we talked about this. No permits, no paper trail. That was the deal." "I know, but they have photos of the window. And Tyler's been sick, headaches and nausea. The inspector thinks it might be related to the construction." Mike's voice turned cold. "Lady, I did exactly what you asked for. If your kid is sick, that's not my problem. And if you're thinking about throwing me under the bus, remember that you paid me cash specifically to avoid permits. You're as guilty as I am." The line went dead. Karen stared at her phone, realizing she was completely alone in this crisis. Over the next 24 hours, Karen's desperation led to increasingly reckless decisions. She researched ways to forge building permits online. She considered hiring another contractor to quickly install proper ventilation. She contemplated claiming the basement work had been done by the previous homeowner years earlier. Meanwhile, Tyler's condition worsened. He missed 2 days of school, complaining of severe headaches, dizziness, and episodes of confusion. When David suggested taking him to the emergency room, Karen convinced him it was just a flu bug that needed to run its course. "He'll be fine," she insisted, terrified that medical tests might reveal carbon monoxide poisoning and lead to questions about their home environment. The night before Rodriguez's return visit, Karen made her most dangerous decision yet. She descended into the basement with a screwdriver and began dismantling evidence of the most obvious violations. She removed the decorative gas fireplace's visible components, patched holes in walls where unauthorized electrical work was accessible, and even attempted to disconnect the bathroom exhaust fan that was pumping contaminated air throughout the house. What Karen didn't understand was that her amateur attempts to hide Mike's work were creating new hazards. Disconnecting the gas fireplace without properly capping the line increased the leak rate. Her electrical modifications left live wires exposed behind walls. Most critically, her attempt to fix the bathroom ventilation created a backdraft situation that would soon pump deadly gases directly into Tyler's sleeping area. By 2 a.m., Karen surveyed her work with grim satisfaction. The basement looked less obviously renovated, more like a space that had been gradually improved over time, rather than professionally remodeled in a few weeks. She couldn't smell the gas that was now leaking at triple the previous rate. She couldn't detect the carbon monoxide building to lethal levels in the poorly ventilated space, and she had no way of knowing that her electrical modifications had created multiple fire hazards that were heating up inside the walls. Inspector Rodriguez arrived promptly at 9 a.m. the next morning. This time he wasn't alone. Linda Chen, the city's electrical inspector, accompanied him along with Gary Walsh from the fire marshal's office. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rodriguez said, "given the health concerns you mentioned and the nature of the complaints, we're conducting a comprehensive safety inspection today." Karen's stomach dropped as she realized the scope of what was about to unfold. 3 inspectors meant they suspected serious violations. The presence of the fire marshal suggested someone had reported potential fire hazards. "Of course," she managed, stepping aside to let them enter. "Though I should mention that Tyler is feeling much better today." It was another lie. Tyler was actually unconscious upstairs, overcome by carbon monoxide levels that had spiked overnight due to Karen's repairs. David had found him unresponsive that morning and was currently racing toward the hospital, frantically calling Karen's phone. Karen's phone buzzed with David's 7th missed call just as Inspector Rodriguez reached the basement door. "Shall we start downstairs?" he asked. Karen nodded, knowing that her next words would either save her family or destroy everything she'd worked to protect. Behind the basement door lay evidence of violations that could result in criminal charges, massive fines, and the complete destruction of her reputation. But none of that mattered anymore. Upstairs, Tyler was fighting for his life, and the gas leak Karen had accidentally tripled was turning her dream home into a ticking time bomb. The inspection that was meant to expose her lies was about to prevent a tragedy that would have made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. Karen's phone buzzed again as she led the three inspectors toward the basement stairs. David's name flashed on the screen for the 8th time. She declined the call, her hands trembling as she reached for the basement door handle. "Mrs. Whitfield," Inspector Rodriguez said, "you might want to take that call. It sounds urgent." "It's probably just work," Karen lied, but her voice cracked. She opened the basement door, and immediately, Gary Walsh from the fire marshal's office stepped forward. "Stop." His voice was sharp, authoritative. "I'm detecting a strong gas odor." All three inspectors froze on the stairs. Walsh pulled out a handheld gas detector, and within seconds it began beeping rapidly. Everyone out. Now, Walsh's training kicked in as he herded the group back upstairs. "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to evacuate this house immediately and shut off your gas main." Karen's world tilted. "But I don't smell anything." "Ma'am, you may have olfactory fatigue from prolonged exposure," Linda Chen, the electrical inspector, explained while already moving toward the front door. "That's extremely dangerous. How long have you been noticing gas odors?" The question hung in the air as Karen's phone rang again. This time, Rodriguez answered for her. "Hello. This is City Inspector Rodriguez at 1247 Maple Grove Drive. Yes, I'm with Mrs. Whitfield." "What? When?" Karen watched Rodriguez's expression change from professional concern to alarm. He handed her the phone. "Karen, thank God." David's voice was strained, panicked. "Tyler collapsed this morning. We're at Memorial Hospital. The doctors think it's carbon monoxide poisoning. They want to know if there's been any construction or gas work at the house." The phone slipped from Karen's fingers, clattering on the hardwood floor. Inspector Walsh was already outside, locating the gas shutoff valve while talking rapidly into his radio. Through the window, Karen could see fire trucks approaching in the distance. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rodriguez said gently but firmly, "we need to know exactly what work was done in this house. Your son's life may depend on it." The dam finally burst. "We converted the basement," Karen whispered, then louder. "We converted the basement without permits. Mike DeLuca did the work. There's electrical, plumbing, gas lines. I don't know what all he did." Linda Chen was already on her phone with the utility company. "I need an emergency gas shutoff at 1247 Maple Grove Drive. Possible major leak with carbon monoxide exposure. Yes, we have a victim already hospitalized." The next hour passed in a blur of emergency vehicles, uniformed responders, and grim-faced officials. The fire department cleared the surrounding houses as a precaution. Utility workers swarmed Karen's property, tracing gas lines and testing air quality throughout the neighborhood. Margaret Chen appeared at Karen's elbow as they stood on the sidewalk, watching the controlled chaos. "Karen, I'm so sorry about Tyler. Is he going to be okay?" Karen couldn't meet her neighbor's eyes. "They don't know yet. He's on oxygen, but the carbon monoxide levels in his blood were dangerously high." "The gas smell I mentioned last month," Margaret said quietly. "You knew, didn't you?" Karen nodded, tears finally coming. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could fix it without anyone finding out." Detective Sarah Morrison from the police department approached with a notepad and a serious expression. The situation had escalated beyond building code violations when Tyler's hospitalization revealed potential criminal negligence. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you some questions about the unpermitted work in your home. Were you aware that the construction created hazardous conditions?" Karen's mind reeled. Criminal charges? She'd never considered that her deception could result in actual crimes. "I didn't know it was dangerous. The contractor said everything would be fine." "What contractor?" "I'll need his full contact information." Karen provided Mike DeLuca's details, knowing she was likely ending his career while trying to save herself from criminal liability. But Mike had abandoned her when she needed help, and Tyler was fighting for his life because of shortcuts they both agreed to. By afternoon, the scope of the violations became clear. The utility company's report was damning. Multiple gas leaks, improper venting that had filled the house with carbon monoxide, and electrical work that had created fire hazards throughout the structure. Karen's amateur attempts to hide evidence the night before had turned manageable problems into life-threatening emergencies. "Mrs. Whitfield," Inspector Rodriguez explained as Karen sat in her car, having nowhere else to go, "your house is uninhabitable. The gas company has red-tagged the property. You cannot return until every violation is corrected and the structure passes comprehensive safety inspections." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe longer. The basement will need to be completely gutted and rebuilt to code. The electrical system requires replacement. The HVAC system is contaminated and must be remediated." Karen calculated costs in her head: temporary housing, complete reconstruction, legal fees, potential fines, and now Tyler's medical bills. The money she'd saved by avoiding permits would cost her tens of thousands to fix properly. David arrived from the hospital that evening, his face haggard and his eyes cold. Tyler was stable but would require ongoing treatment for carbon monoxide exposure. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but potential long-term neurological effects remained unknown. "How could you do this?" David's voice was barely controlled rage. "How could you risk our son's life to save money on permits?" Karen had no answer that would satisfy him. Every explanation sounded like an excuse, every justification revealed another layer of deception. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought Mike knew what he was doing. You knew enough to lie to me about it. You knew enough to hide it from the city. You knew enough to dismiss Tyler's symptoms when I wanted to take him to the doctor." The truth hit Karen like a physical blow. She hadn't just made bad decisions about construction. She'd actively prevented Tyler from getting medical help and showed signs of poisoning. Her cover-up had nearly killed her own son. That night, staying in a hotel room paid for with credit cards, Karen finally understood the true cost of her choices. Tyler's health remained uncertain. Her marriage was hanging by a thread. Her house was uninhabitable and facing massive reconstruction costs. Criminal charges were possible, and Mike DeLuca had disappeared, leaving her to face everything alone. But the worst revelation was still coming. As she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Karen had no idea that her midnight tampering with the gas lines had created an even more dangerous situation than the one inspectors had discovered. The gas leak they'd found and stopped was only the beginning. Deep in the walls and crawl spaces of 1247 Maple Grove Drive, other problems were brewing, problems that would soon test whether Karen's nightmare could get any worse. It could, and it would. 3 weeks after the evacuation, Karen stood in the lobby of the Millbrook County Courthouse, clutching a folder of legal documents and trying to steady her nerves. Her attorney, Patricia Vance, had been blunt about the charges: reckless endangerment, building code violations, and potential child endangerment related to Tyler's carbon monoxide poisoning. The prosecutor is offering a plea deal, Patricia explained as they waited for their hearing. Community service, substantial fines, and restitution for Tyler's medical expenses. But Karen, this goes on your permanent record, and the civil liability from neighbors affected by the gas leak could be significant. Karen nodded numbly. The Chens had already filed suit after their children developed respiratory problems from contaminated air. The Johnsons were claiming property damage from the emergency evacuation. Eden families 3 blocks away were testing their homes for gas contamination, creating a spreading circle of liability with Karen at the center. Meanwhile, Mike DeLuca had vanished completely. His business license was suspended, his phone disconnected, and his registered address led to an empty apartment. Karen's attempts to shift blame to the contractor were falling flat when she couldn't even locate him for questioning. Tyler's recovery was progressing slowly. The neurological effects of carbon monoxide poisoning were subtle but concerning: memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, persistent headaches. His college applications were on hold while he underwent cognitive testing to assess potential permanent damage. "Mom," Tyler had said during one of Karen's hospital visits, "why didn't you just get the permits?" It was the question that haunted Karen's sleepless nights. Why hadn't she just followed the rules? The permit process would have cost money and time, but nothing approaching the catastrophe she now faced. "I thought I was being smart," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "I thought I was taking care of our family." David had moved into a furnished apartment across town. Their conversations were limited to Tyler's medical needs and the mounting legal complications. Divorce papers were being prepared, with Karen's deception cited as irreconcilable differences compounded by endangering their child. But the courthouse hearing would prove to be the least of Karen's worries that day. While Karen sat through her arraignment, pleading no contest to 3 misdemeanor charges, emergency coordinator Lisa Torres was reviewing a troubling report at City Hall. The post-evacuation inspection of 1247 Maple Grove Drive had revealed problems that extended far beyond the Whitfield property. The gas leak was more extensive than initially detected, Torres explained to her supervisor. Utility crews found compromised lines running under at least 4 neighboring properties. "We're looking at potential soil contamination and structural damage to nearby foundations." The scope of environmental impact was staggering. Mike DeLuca's shortcuts hadn't just endangered the Whitfield family. They created a hazardous waste situation affecting the entire block. Remediation costs were estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, with Karen potentially liable for the full amount. That afternoon, as Karen returned to her hotel room clutching court-ordered community service paperwork, her phone rang with news that would shatter what remained of her financial security. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Janet Hayes from Consolidated Insurance." The voice was professionally cold. "I'm calling regarding your homeowner's policy claim. After reviewing the circumstances of your property damage, we're denying coverage for any losses related to unpermitted construction work." Karen sank onto the hotel bed. What does that mean exactly? It means you're personally liable for all remediation costs, medical expenses, and property damage resulting from the illegal construction. Our investigation shows you deliberately concealed the work from inspectors and insurance adjusters. That constitutes fraud, which voids your coverage. The number was staggering: $847,000 in total estimated costs. House remediation, environmental cleanup, medical bills, legal settlements, and fines. Karen's savings account contained $23,000. Their retirement fund held another $180,000. Even selling their uninhabitable house would leave them hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. That evening, Karen sat in her car outside Memorial Hospital, gathering courage to visit Tyler. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. "Karen, I'm sorry to bother you, but we need to evacuate our house again. The utility company found another gas leak that might be connected to your property line. The fire department says it's getting worse." Karen stared at the message, realizing that her nightmare was still expanding. Even 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Mike's shoddy work continued creating new problems. Every day brought fresh reports of contamination, structural damage, or safety hazards that traced back to the basement renovation she'd been so proud of. Inside the hospital, Tyler was sitting up in bed, working on physical therapy exercises designed to address his coordination problems. He looked younger than his 17 years, vulnerable in his hospital gown with monitoring equipment still attached. "The doctors say I can go home next week," he told Karen, then paused. "Except we don't have a home anymore, do we?" Karen fought back tears. "We'll figure something out. Maybe rent a place until..." "Until what, Mom?" "Until we can afford to fix the house. Dad says that's going to take years. Your father is upset right now. Once things settle down..." "Mom, stop." Tyler's voice was tired but clear. "I heard the doctors talking. The carbon monoxide exposure could have killed me. And you knew something was wrong but didn't want me to see a doctor because you were afraid they'd find out about the basement." Karen had no defense against the truth. She had prioritized protecting her secret over protecting her son's health. No amount of regret could change that fundamental betrayal of parental responsibility. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know you are. But sorry doesn't fix my brain damage, Mom. Sorry doesn't give me back the senior year I'm missing. Sorry doesn't make Dad trust you again." Tyler turned toward the window, ending the conversation. Karen sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching her son stare at nothing while machines monitored the ongoing effects of her choices. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter. In a few months, it would be a year since Mike DeLuca first arrived at her house with promises of quick, cheap renovation work. Karen had thought she was being clever, saving money and avoiding bureaucratic hassles. Instead, she destroyed her family, bankrupted her future, and created an environmental disaster that would affect her neighborhood for years to come. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive sat empty and contaminated, a monument to the consequences of cutting corners and ignoring safety regulations. But Karen's ordeal was far from over. As she sat in a hospital room, utility workers were making the discovery in her abandoned basement that would soon make national news and transform her local scandal into a cautionary tale that would be studied in engineering schools and safety courses across the country. The gas leak they'd stopped was nothing compared to what was still growing in the walls of her dream home. And this time, when it finally let loose, there would be no inspectors to catch it in time. 2 months after the evacuation, Karen's house stood like a tomb in the heart of Millbrook Estates. Yellow caution tape fluttered around the property, and warning signs posted by the city cautioned against entry. The manicured lawn had died from gas contamination seeping through the soil, leaving brown patches that spread like infection across what had once been Karen's pride and joy. Inside the abandoned structure, invisible forces were building toward catastrophe. The electrical problems Mike DeLuca had created were worsening in the unheated, unmonitored house. Temperature fluctuations caused wire connections to expand and contract, loosening junction boxes that were already improperly installed. In the basement walls, where Karen had attempted her midnight repairs, exposed wires sparked intermittently against metal conduits, creating micro-arcs that heated the surrounding insulation. But the electrical hazards were nothing compared to what was happening in the crawl space. When utility workers had shut off the main gas line, they'd stopped the largest leak but missed a crucial detail. Karen's panicked tampering with a decorative fireplace had damaged a secondary line that fed from a different meter, a line that continued pumping natural gas into the confined space beneath the house. The gas was accumulating in pockets throughout the structure, creating an increasingly explosive atmosphere. Weather patterns made everything worse. An unusually warm February followed by sudden temperature drops created pressure differentials that pushed gas through cracks in the foundation and gaps around improperly sealed penetrations. The house was slowly filling with natural gas while electrical problems provided multiple ignition sources. Dr. Michael Chen, an environmental engineer hired by the insurance company, had been monitoring the property's contamination levels when he made a discovery that would later be described as miraculous timing by the National Transportation Safety Board. "The readings don't make sense," Chen told his assistant as they reviewed atmospheric data from sensors placed around the perimeter. "Gas concentrations should be declining, but they're actually increasing inside the structure." Chen's investigation revealed the secondary gas line that everyone had missed. More critically, his thermal imaging showed hot spots in the electrical system that indicated imminent fire hazards. The combination of accumulating gas and deteriorating electrical systems was creating what engineering textbooks would later call a perfect storm of failure modes. "We need to evacuate the surrounding area immediately," Chen reported to the fire marshal. "That house is essentially a bomb waiting for a spark." Meanwhile, Karen was dealing with her own perfect storm of legal and financial disasters. The community service judge had assigned her to work at a homeless shelter, where she spent 40 hours a week serving meals to people who'd lost their homes through circumstances beyond their control. The irony wasn't lost on her that she made herself homeless through her own choices. Tyler was living with David in the furnished apartment, attending physical therapy 3 times a week and struggling with cognitive issues that made his senior year nearly impossible. College acceptance letters were arriving for a young man who could no longer reliably remember conversations from day to day. The neuropsychologist says the memory problems might improve, David told Karen during one of their awkward coffee meetings to discuss Tyler's care, but some effects could be permanent. "Our son might never fully recover from what your shortcuts did to him." Karen had stopped trying to defend herself. The evidence was overwhelming and the consequences spoke for themselves. She had risked everything to save time and money, and instead had cost Tyler his health, destroyed their family, and created financial obligations that would take decades to resolve. But on March 15th, Karen's personal catastrophe was about to become national news. Dr. Chen's evacuation order had been delayed by bureaucratic processes and jurisdictional confusion between city, county, and utility company authorities. The gas concentrations continued building while officials debated response protocols and liability issues. Local residents were growing frustrated with the ongoing disruption to their neighborhood. Margaret Chen called Karen that evening with news that would chill her blood. "Karen, I know we haven't talked much since everything happened, but I thought you should know. Some of the neighbors are planning to petition the city to declare your house a public nuisance and have it demolished." "Demolished?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "The contamination keeps spreading. 3 more families have had to evacuate temporarily. Property values are plummeting. People are scared and angry, and they want the problem gone." Karen understood their frustration, but the house represented the last remnant of her financial security. Even contaminated and uninhabitable, the land had value. Demolition would leave her with nothing but debt. When are they filing the petition? Monday morning. But Karen, there's something else. The utility crews were back today. They looked really worried about something they found. That something was the secondary gas line that Dr. Chen had discovered. Emergency crews were finally locating and mapping all of Mike DeLuca's unauthorized modifications, revealing a network of problems that extended far beyond anything previously understood. At 3:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning, March 17th, the perfect storm finally arrived. A faulty electrical connection in the basement wall, one of Karen's attempted repairs from months earlier, generated a spark that ignited gas vapors accumulated in the crawl space. The explosion wasn't massive by industrial standards, but in a residential neighborhood, it was devastating. The blast launched Karen's custom pergola across 3 backyards, shattered windows in a half-mile radius, and created a fireball that briefly turned night into day. The house didn't collapse, but the explosion damaged foundations throughout the neighborhood and started fires in adjacent properties. Miraculously, no one was killed. The evacuation orders and late-night timing meant the immediate area was clear of residents. But 7 people were hospitalized with injuries from flying debris and glass, and the environmental damage would take years to fully assess. Karen learned about the explosion from a phone call that woke her at 4:15 a.m. She stood at her hotel room window, watching the orange glow on the horizon where her neighborhood was burning, and finally understood the true scope of what her choices had unleashed. The house that was supposed to give Tyler independence had nearly killed him. The renovation that was meant to improve their family life had destroyed it. The shortcuts that seemed so clever had created a disaster that would be studied by safety experts for decades. As fire trucks screamed past her hotel and news helicopters began circling the destruction, Karen realized that her story was about to become much bigger than one family's poor decisions. She was about to become the face of what happens when built-in codes are ignored and safety regulations are treated as suggestions. The explosion at 1247 Maple Grove Drive would make national headlines, spawn congressional hearings on building code enforcement, and become a case study in engineering schools worldwide. But for Karen Whitfield, it was simply the final terrible confirmation that some mistakes can never be undone. 6 months after the explosion, Karen sat in a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of town, watching her story unfold on the evening news. The reporter stood in front of what had once been her dream home, now a blackened foundation surrounded by construction equipment and environmental remediation crews. The Whitfield incident has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unpermitted construction, the anchor explained. Congressional lawmakers are citing this case as they draft new federal oversight requirements for building code enforcement. Karen muted the television. She'd seen enough news coverage to last several lifetimes. Her face had been on magazine covers, her story dissected in engineering journals, and her name attached to proposed legislation called the Whitfield Safety Standards Act. She'd become nationally infamous for all the wrong reasons. The legal aftermath had been swift and merciless. Criminal charges were upgraded to felonies after the explosion, resulting in 2 years probation, substantial fines, and a civil judgment that would follow Karen for the rest of her life. The total financial liability had reached $2.3 million, covering neighborhood property damage, environmental cleanup, medical expenses, and punitive damages. Mike DeLuca had eventually been located in Florida, working under an assumed name for another unlicensed construction company. His arrest had made headlines briefly, but Karen remained the primary focus of public attention as the homeowner who'd orchestrated the entire catastrophe. Tyler's recovery had plateaued at about 70% of his pre-exposure cognitive function. He'd started college a year late at a local community school, his Ivy League dreams derailed by memory problems and processing delays that would be permanent reminders of his mother's choices. The bright, ambitious teenager who'd moved into that basement suite was gone forever, replaced by a young man who struggled with tasks that had once been effortless. He's adapting well, David had told Karen during the monthly check-in about Tyler's progress. But Karen, he'll never be the same. The doctors say his IQ dropped about 15 points. He was going to study engineering, and now he can barely handle basic math. David had remarried 8 months after their divorce was finalized. His new wife, a teacher named Sarah, had never met the Karen who'd once hosted elaborate garden parties and managed household renovations with apparent expertise. She only knew the cautionary tale, the woman whose poor judgment had nearly killed her own son. Karen's days were structured around survival and restitution. She worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at a dental office and evening hours at a call center, earning barely enough to cover her apartment rent and minimum payments on her massive debt. Her wages were garnished for victim compensation, leaving her with less money than many minimum wage workers despite her education and previous middle-class lifestyle. The Millbrook Estates neighborhood had slowly recovered, but scars remained visible everywhere. Property values had dropped 30% and hadn't recovered. Several families had moved away, unable to cope with the ongoing environmental testing and remediation work. The lot where Karen's house had stood was now a small park with a memorial plaque honoring community resilience, a euphemistic way of acknowledging the disaster without mentioning her name. Dr. Michael Chen, the environmental engineer whose monitoring had prevented fatalities during the explosion, had become something of a celebrity in safety circles. He testified before Congress about the incident and written extensively about the cascade of failures that had turned a simple permit violation into a neighborhood catastrophe. The Whitfield case demonstrates how individual decisions to bypass safety systems can have exponential consequences. He'd written in Engineering Safety Quarterly. What began as a homeowner trying to save a few $1,000s in permit fees ultimately cost millions in damage and created health impacts that will affect victims for decades. Karen had been invited to participate in Dr. Chen's research, sharing details about her decision-making process for academic study. She declined initially, too ashamed to relive her choices, but eventually agreed when she learned the research might prevent similar incidents. During those interviews, Karen had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about her motivations. It wasn't just about saving money or avoiding bureaucratic delays. She'd enjoyed the feeling of outsmarting the system, of getting away with something that other homeowners couldn't or wouldn't attempt. The secrecy had been thrilling until it became terrifying. I thought I was being clever, she told Dr. Chen during one particularly difficult session. I thought the rules were for other people who weren't as smart or careful as I was. And when you started noticing problems, the gas smell, Tyler's symptoms, the electrical issues, what prevented you from seeking help? Karen had struggled to articulate the psychology of escalating deception. Once you start lying, admitting the truth means admitting you were wrong about everything. I kept thinking I could fix it myself, that I could make the problems go away without anyone finding out how stupid I'd been. The interviews had become part of a documentary film about building safety that would air on public television. Karen's participation had earned her a small honorarium, but more importantly, it had given her story educational value beyond sensational headlines. Tyler had visited her apartment for the first time the previous month, their relationship slowly rebuilding through shared acknowledgement of what had been lost. He brought college brochures, showing her his plans to study environmental safety, a career choice directly influenced by his experience with her renovation disaster. "I want to help prevent what happened to us from happening to other families," he'd explained. "Maybe something good can come from all this." Karen had cried that day, seeing glimpses of the thoughtful, ambitious young man Tyler had been before carbon monoxide poisoning altered his brain chemistry. His career choice felt like both forgiveness and a lifetime reminder of her failures. The financial restitution would continue for decades. At current payment rates, Karen would be 73 years old when her obligations were finally satisfied. She'd lost her house, her marriage, her comfortable lifestyle, and her reputation, but she gained something unexpected: a thorough understanding of why building codes exist and what happens when they're ignored. Local building departments now used Karen's case in training materials for new inspectors. Community colleges included her story in construction management courses. Safety organizations featured her incident in presentations about the importance of permit compliance. Karen Whitfield had become the poster child for construction disasters, but she'd also become an advocate for the regulations she once viewed as obstacles. Her speaking engagements at homeowner association meetings and community safety events were part of her court-ordered community service, but they'd evolved into something more meaningful. Building codes aren't suggestions, she would tell audiences of homeowners considering renovation projects. They're written in blood, the blood of people who died in fires, explosions, and structural collapses before we learned better. When you bypass those codes, you're gambling with lives. The irony wasn't lost on Karen that she'd become an expert on the very regulations she once ignored. Her intimate knowledge of what could go wrong made her uniquely qualified to explain why rules existed and what happened when they were violated. As evening settled over her small apartment, Karen looked at the photo on her desk, the only picture she'd salvaged from the house before the explosion. It showed Tyler at 16, grinning in front of their old basement before Mike DeLuca's renovations began. He looked bright, healthy, and full of potential that would never be fully realized. The renovation that was supposed to give Tyler independence had stolen his future instead. The shortcuts that seemed so clever had cost him cognitive abilities he'd never recover. The money Karen had saved on permits had cost for everything she worked to build. But Tyler was alive and their relationship was healing. The neighborhood had recovered and implemented better safety protocols. Legislation inspired by her case would protect other families from similar disasters. From the wreckage of her poor choices, something constructive was slowly emerging. Karen Whitfield would never again be the confident woman who'd hosted garden parties and managed elaborate home improvements. She'd become something different, a living reminder of why safety regulations matter and what happens when individual arrogance collides with physics and chemistry. The explosion that destroyed her house had happened at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September, but Karen's real education had begun the moment she decided permits were optional, leading to a catastrophe that taught her, and eventually thousands of others, that some rules exist for reasons too important to ignore. Her story would outlive her, passed down through safety courses and engineering textbooks as proof that building codes are written in the blood of people who learn too late that cutting corners can cost everything.